I met him and heard him speak last year at University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and I said, that is someone that teachers need to hear. So we're very fortunate that he has been willing to come, in spite of the fact that in about 24 hours he'll be embarking, less than 24 hours he'll be embarking on a multi-country tour before he gets back to his home institution. So we're really, really grateful that he was able to sort of squeeze us in. He holds a Canada Research Chair in Indian Ocean World History at McGill University and gained degrees in economic history from universities of Birmingham and Wales, and has taught in India as voluntary service overseas, as well as in universities in Madagascar, Britain, South Africa, Belgium, and France. He's a specialist in economic history of the Indian Ocean region and a member of McGill Center for Developing Area Studies African Studies program. His current research is focused on the foundations of the Indian Ocean region's connections to global economy, as well as slavery, migration, and diasporas in the Indian Ocean region. He's particularly interested in the dynamics of minority cultures, imperialism, globalization, and third world development. Among his other interests include painting, poetry, and prose, and following the Welsh rugby team. So we're very glad to have him here, and welcome.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for the reception. As Susan said, I'm the director of the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill. This is something which is crazy when you think about it, that the Canadian federal government invest in something such as a chair in Indian Ocean World History. And the Indian Ocean world is broadly defined as the entire macro region running from, if you like, roads lying from the Cape to Cairo, right through to the Far East. So that's a huge macro region. And in terms of conventional approaches to that region, as you all know, the temporal paradigms applied to it are Eurocentric. They're ones that most of Western academia is organized around. Ancient history, medieval history, early modern, modern, contemporary, all of which emanate from 19th century concerns in Western Europe. So they're quintessentially Eurocentric, and I would argue fit very badly any study of indigenous non-Western societies. And then in terms of spatial paradigms, what has been imposed on this traditionally has been, first of all, a concern with ancient civilizations, China, South Asia, the Middle East, that Europeans considered to be civilized with hierarchical structures, religious structures, organized religions, and literate. And that demarked them as civilized as opposed to uncivilized regions, such as most of island Southeast Asia and most of Africa, which tended to have decentralized polities, primitive religious concepts, and which were, for the most part, illiterate. So that Western academia has tended to concentrate, they have Chinese studies, South Asian studies, Middle Eastern studies, but for the rest it's sort of, they group it as regional studies. So Southeast Asian or African. And breaking that down, you tend to find colonial divisions. So that Sub-Saharan Africa is basically divided into West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, Central Africa, and then down into colonial states, Kenya, Tanzania, etc. But these are colonial paradigms. If we go back to pre-colonial times, no such borders existed, no such political frontiers existed. So again, we have paradigms that are applied to this region which do not fully express the indigenous reality through time. Now, I would ask you to suspend belief in those paradigms. So discard for the moment any idea that we can abide by such divisions in time as ancient, medieval, early modern, modern. So throw away those crutches, and also discard the spatial paradigms that we're used to discuss in this region. And I would ask you to think of an alternative paradigm, an alternative way, an alternative lens through which to view this area. And that is one of human-environment interaction. And this isn't a simplistic notion. It isn't environmental determinism. This is rather a complex and changing and dynamic interaction between human factors and environmental factors. So in a sense, it's dethroning the human from being the god of history and saying that there is something far more important that I think we all realize now with global warming, which is that the environment and complex environmental factors have played an enormously important role in influencing humans and humans in influencing the environment, and that has always been the case. So if we take human-environment interaction as the basic leitmotif of the history of this region, then suddenly this entire area becomes understandable. We break down, we get rid of the area studies approach, the country approaches, and we see this entire region as a unitary region. And there are various factors within the environment that promote that understanding. One of the basic ones, as you probably read in the readings, is the monsoon system. The monsoon system is unique to this area of the world. It doesn't exist in the Atlantic world, it doesn't exist in the Pacific world. It exists in this part of the world for one reason. This is the only major ocean which is capped by a huge continental mass to the north. And as Asia heats up in summer, so you get a basic physical reaction, which is that it heats up, hot air rises, creates a vacuum, and sucks in, it's convection, sucks in air, moist air from the oceans to the south of it. So in the northern hemisphere summer, as Asia heats up, it sucks in moist air from the oceans, and that creates the southwest monsoons. The reverse happens in winter. So as the Asian continent cools down, it expels air, and that pushes air back, and you get a reverse system creating the northeast monsoons. So this is a unique system of biannual interchange of winds and currents. What does that do? Well, it immediately offers, with the southwest monsoons, which are the full of moisture, that's when the monsoon rains come, the whole of this area, the whole of the rim, from it affects East Africa, but in particular South Asia and into China. It creates the possibility of wet crop cultivation. Humans adapt to that, but it gives that possibility. In other words, it profoundly affects the agricultural regime across this entire region. So you get a belt near the ocean, a belt of wet crop, particularly rice, cultivation. Then behind that, as the monsoons die out, so in other words, as you get into the more arid hinterland of the continental mass, then dry crops, typically things like wheat and barley. But it's the monsoon system, therefore, that in a sense dictates what humans can do with agriculture. This is seasonal, so the monsoons also affect communication across land. It's virtually impossible to move across that southern sector during the monsoon rains. So that communication, territorial communication, is limited to the dry season, which means that trade across that area is limited to the dry season, which happens to fit in very well with what the monsoons do to the oceans, because you have this biannual change of winds and currents, which creates the possibility, once humans have developed ships that are flexible enough to cope with their very strong winds, ships that are flexible enough to cope with the strong waves and the strong winds. Once humans have developed the ships and the sails and the navigational techniques, and they're fortunate in this area because there's very little cloud cover, so it's mainly astral navigation, then you have the possibility of direct transoceanic sail in one direction for 6 months of the year and the reverse for the other 6 months. I'm simplifying somewhat because you have an interchange when the monsoons change, but nevertheless that is the system. So for the first time, as soon as humans develop the ability to create the craft and the sails and the navigational techniques to do that, you have the possibility of direct, very fast, very efficient transoceanic sail in the two directions. It's theoretically possible to do it a long distance return voyage in 1 year, theoretically. So you have three, in a sense, interlocking systems. One agricultural, one trade across land, which is restricted to the dry season, and then the monsoon system, which permits biannual traffic, and it tends to coincide, or the humans arrange for it to coincide with dry season storage. So as you get an interlocking of the continental and the maritime trade routes. This creates the possibility of what I term an Indian Ocean world global economy. By global I mean very long distance. It's a huge macro region, one that extends from Eastern Africa to the Far East, in which there's the rise of a very sophisticated, very complex exchange of commodities, ideas, humans, monies, ideologies, etc. Also, of course, plants and animals. If we take that concept, let's run with it for a while. If we take that concept, human-environment interaction, then we can see a different temporal paradigm with which to view that entire region. One that's organized around the principle of the environment rather than European history. The first stage is the end of the last ice age. Global warming, which permits the expansion of human beings from favored areas, microclimates, which were favorable, expanding out. These are basically hunter-gatherers who break out of previous niches, geographical niches, and expand with the melting of the glaciers. The next stage, so that's about, 10,000 years ago. The next stage, which was around 6,000 BCE, is a growing aridification. The climate becomes much drier. This is when you get the expansion of the Sahara south and you get the desertification of much of the Middle East. And the same phenomenon occurs elsewhere. This pushes humans to very carefully control water resources. Water is vital. Water is vital for human beings. And they not only control the water resources, but it also pushes them towards domestication. So domestication of basic crops, basic animals. And here you get the rise of three major, the whole process, the Neolithic Revolution, is much more diffuse than was previously imagined. It was conventionally believed that it was centered China, South Asia, the Middle East. It's now clear that there were experiments over a much wider region. But nevertheless, it gave rise, once you got the concentration of water control techniques, of domestication of plants and animals, then you get the rise of sedentary populations, so movement from the hunter-gatherer and nomadic styles to sedentary agricultural populations. It's absolutely essential that those populations, if they're going to increase their agricultural productivity, stay put. And as agricultural productivity increases, so societies develop in certain key areas. You get them in China, South Asia, Middle East, Egypt, where elites control both the labor and the produce of that labor in key areas where there's control of water. Elites emerge, tiny elites, who basically geographically restrict the population. They fix them to certain places, and then they direct their labor. As a result of that, productivity increases. You get demographic expansion, a certain specialization, so craftsmen emerge, and the possibilities for longer distance trade increases. So that happens from about 6,000, and it's accelerated. There was a major drought, a cataclysmic drought, around 2000 BCE, which accelerated that process. And I think it's probably no coincidence that it's about that time that you get the emergence of major hierarchical, elite-controlled polities in those key areas.
You said the drought was around when?
2000 BCE. This promotes long-distance trade, and around about sort of 500 BCE, you get the regularization of what is termed the Silk Road. So it becomes a regular trans-Asian road linking the Middle East to China. About the same time there's climatic change, the monsoon system becomes stronger, becomes more regular. And it's at this precise moment that once humans start developing the ships and the sails that I mentioned earlier, you've got the possibility of direct transoceanic trade. And by about 300 BCE, there are clear signs of direct trade across the different segments of the Indian Ocean. This has been sort of classically, it's a huge area. So in general, you talk about three lakes. One is the Western Indian Ocean, the Eastern Indian Ocean, and then the South China Sea, with this extension into the Indonesian archipelago. But from around 300 BCE, the start of direct sail across each of these three lakes. That is the foundation point of the Indian Ocean world global economy. There's an amelioration of the climate. There's a huge increase in productivity and major exchange that runs right throughout this region. And that endures until about 300 CE. I'm using BCE CE rather than BC AD. So for about 600, maybe 500 to 600 years, a major boom, the first major boom in the Indian Ocean world global economy. This is over 1,000 years before Europeans sail out of their tiny, dank North European corner and discover the world. 1,000 years. So the foundation of a sophisticated system of very long distance exchange. There are clear signs, however, that between about 300, and these are very rough estimates, between about 300 CE and the 9th century, there is serious economic instability and a decline in economic activity in the Indian Ocean world global economy. And that's directly related to a deterioration in environmental factors, part of which is due to human action. Because in this period between 300 BCE and CE, human beings, this is a rise in agricultural productivity, human beings are clearing forest at an enormous rate. They're using iron technology at an enormous rate. And this process in certain key areas is adding CO2 to the atmosphere. You get clear signs. Scientists are picking it up now in the ice caps. Clear signs of a rise in CO2 emissions during that period. And by about the 3rd century CE, there's growing aridification. The climate becomes drier. There are also a series, in that period from about 300 CE to the 9th century, a series of major volcanic eruptions. Volcanic eruptions which throw sulfur up into the atmosphere, obscures the sun, lowers surface temperatures, and even slight variations in temperature can ruin harvests. There was one particularly cataclysmic volcanic eruption. It's just recently been identified as coming from El Salvador in 535. And is probably the biggest volcanic eruption since that time. In other words, it beats even Tambora, which was previously thought to have been the biggest in 1815. The records are quite clear from the Mediterranean, Greek records, Latin records. They're quite clear that this was catastrophic. It turned day to night. Lasted something like 3 years. There were no summers. It lowered surface temperatures by, it's estimated, these are scientific estimates, these are all in the scientific journals, by about 3 degrees. As a result, massive harvest failure, famine, social and political turmoil, and migration. Not only that, that's 535. In 541-2, the eruption of the first pandemic of the bubonic plague, the so-called Justinian plague, shortly follows. And it's probably associated, because what drives the plague-carrying rodent out of the burrows in the wilds is generally aridification. So the huge volcanic eruption of 535 is probably associated with the outbreak of bubonic plague just a few years later. And that went in cycles. It went in sort of 7-year cycles. Mortality rates of between about 25 and 45% in affected areas. And it came out of this area. No one's quite sure where. Some argue it's the savannas of East Africa. Others say that it's the traditional routes, although there's no indication of it having come from China or Central Asia. A gradual amelioration then from about the 9th century, leading to a second major upsurge in the Indian Ocean world global economy between the 9th and the 13th century. This is Sung China at its height. Technological innovations. Again, with the amelioration of climate, enhanced agricultural productivity, greater specialization, division of labor, development of crafts, long-distance trade, and so enhanced exchange across this entire region between about the 9th and the 13th centuries. Enormous prosperity. That then collapses again into a period of economic instability from the 13th century through to the end of the 18th, and in most of this area up to the mid-19th century. This is the time of the classical Black Death, the 14th century. This is the time of the Little Ice Age, which was at its height between in the 17th century. In the 1640s, there were a cataclysmic series of volcanic eruptions centered on this fault line running through Sumatra, Java. It toppled political regimes. It had the same impact as described for the earlier one from El Salvador. In other words, sulfur, obscuring the sun, harvest failures, famine, political, social turmoil, the fall of political regimes, a decline in total productivity and trade. Recovery then into our global era. So from the mid-19th century, clear signs of an amelioration of the climate, stupendous growth because of technological innovations associated with the Industrial Revolution and an ongoing process that lead to enhanced productivity throughout, but also of man-made CO2 emissions. And the dilemma that we're faced with now of virtually unstoppable global warming. So that I would propose as the alternative temporal paradigm to conventional Eurocentric ones, which are basically organized around Westerners and a Western tunnel vision of history. Perhaps I can just illustrate a few case studies of how this might work out. Let's take, how many of you teach African history? Good. Let's take the so-called Bantu-Speaking migration and expansion. This is a huge debate. It's a huge topic. Bantu speakers started to move out of Central West Africa around 3000 BCE. A basic reason for them moving was because of this desertification that had occurred from about 6000 BCE, which led to the extension of the Sahara to the south, and it had a kind of multiple impact of pushing populations out of the border regions of the Sahara further south. And one of the results of that of these migrations is the Bantu-speaking migration to the south and to the east. That migration was probably delayed by that huge drought in around 2000 BCE. It probably delayed it. But nevertheless, the pioneers, Bantu-speaking pioneers, reached Central East Africa around 1000 BCE. And there they met Cushitic peoples from the north, Nilotic peoples with their cattle from the north, Cushitics who brought sorghum, millet, and also hunter-gatherers. And they adopted cattle. The Bantu speakers were agriculturalists. The yam was their basic staple crop, West African yam. But they adopted cattle, not as a primary occupation, but as a secondary one. They adopted to the growing of sorghum and millet, which enhanced their diet. And then quite critically, they either developed themselves or they adopted from Sudan iron-making technology. This gave them immediate technological superiority over the Cushitic and Nilotic peoples. This was quite high-grade iron ore. And the process of heating it meant that they produced very good iron implements. The hoe, the axe, cutlass, knife. And that enabled them to basically cut down the forest and create agricultural plots and till the soil. The hoe was much better than the plough on these very light soils in the tropics. So it gave Bantu speakers the edge. It enhanced agricultural productivity, therefore demographic growth, therefore all the things we've talked about, specialization, trade, etc. It enabled Bantu speakers to expand. However, it also had the drawback that they were using wood on a massive scale. If you look at iron-making technology and the furnaces and how much wood is needed in order to create good quality iron implements, this is significant. And at the same time, they're cutting down forest, large areas of forest, in order to create land for their agricultural production. So CO2 emissions rise significantly in this area. There's another factor which is, no one's quite sure of the date. There's a huge debate about the origin of the banana in Africa. But the banana is basically from Southeast Asia. And around the time of that first upsurge in the Indian Ocean World Global Economy, so between about 300 BCE and 300 CE, there's clear evidence of what Christopher Ehret calls the Southeast Asian complex of plants. The banana, cassava, East Asian yam, rice, possibly even, and I throw this out there, possibly even maize. There's clear evidence that Southeast Asians were visiting South America way before the Europeans got there and coming back across the Pacific. But certainly the banana. And the banana had a revolutionary impact. It's rich in potassium, it's rich in vitamin, it's rich in sugar. Enormously enhanced the diet of Bantu-speaking peoples and encouraged, therefore, demographic growth and expansion.
You said you think that's around when?
There's people have claimed that they found it's very difficult to find evidence, archaeological remains of plants. But there's a whole debate over carbonized remnants of what some scientists claim is the banana, would you believe, in West Africa in 3000 BCE. That's hugely debated. Others have pointed, there's again one specimen from Central East Africa dating to 800 BCE. But it's clear that in that period from 300 BCE to 300 CE, the banana was having a major impact. You may have heard of a guy called Murdoch, who, a brilliant ethnographer, but he considered that the Southeast Asian complex travelled across Africa from the north, whereas Christopher Errett and others, historical linguists, say it's much more probable that it went up the Zambezi River, through into the Great Lakes region and then across. So there's a clear influence, in other words, a clear reflection of a complex of plants and some animals coming from Southeast Asia. Of course, you've got, I won't enter this, but you've got the same debate then about the Southeast Asian colonization of Madagascar. Another huge debate is there's an Afrocentrist school who say that Bantu speakers reached the Indian Ocean around the BC-CE changeover, so around the time of Christ, and that they then expanded along the littoral of the Indian Ocean and adopted a maritime culture. They became expert boat builders, they became expert sailors, they sailed the high seas. There are some that even say that they were responsible for building, inventing and building the outrigger canoe, something that most scholars say is characteristically Southeast Asian. This is a hot debate. In other words, the Bantu speakers expanded very rapidly and founded the Swahili, what became the Swahili culture from about the 9th century, 10th century. But it was a kind of effortless movement and an entrepreneurship. As an economic historian, this for me, it defies credibility. Because Bantu speakers, by the early centuries CE, it's quite clear from the Periplus and other documents that there were already well-established maritime trade links with East Africa from the Middle East, and possibly from India. Now, to build boats, I don't know how many of you have ever attempted to build a boat, or to sail a boat, or to sail the high seas. These are incredibly complex skills. They basically develop intergenerational in certain specific areas. The capital investment required to build boats and then trade across those regions at huge risk. These voyages would take easily 2 years. So you have to wait for a return on your investment, a considerable time. You may lose your ship, and you've got to be able to take that. You've got to have the skills and techniques of finding water on sandy islands. The Bantu speakers were agriculturalists. They were landlubbers. They were skilled agriculturalists. That was their skill. And the general tendency throughout human history is of division of labor. You do not try to compete with someone else when you don't have their skills. So I see this debate as, for me, it's rather redundant. It's beating the drum a bit too much. Why insist that this was a Bantu-speaking expansion to take over marine technologies. There's absolutely no evidence of any Bantu-speaking captains until about the 13th century, when you've already got a pre-existing system of boat building. Moreover, the archaeological record indicates that there was a decline in the trade in that region from about the 2nd, 3rd century CE. And in the archaeological record, there's very little between about the 4th century and the 8th century CE. Very little. At the same time, there are environmental factors at work which contribute to the deterioration of trade and exchange across that region, the entire region. One of them, it's a phenomenon called the Intertropical Convergence zone, which sits roughly there, both sides of the equator. At sea, it's known as the doldrums. That's what sailors refer to as the doldrums. But during this period, there was general aridification, which was accelerated for equatorial East Africa by a shift north. This intertropical convergence zone, it migrates. There's a shift north to about 30 degrees north in the first 500 years after Christ, which meant that this region became arid. In other words, it accentuated the actions of human beings in clearing the forest, in using wood for iron smelting, and a general tendency of the climate to become more arid. It accentuated that. And the indications are that it pushed Bantu-speaking peoples towards southern Africa, which had more plentiful rainfall. This was precisely the time when Bantu-speaking migrations into southern Africa. But quite enormous difficulty further north in the equatorial zone. By contrast, and this is where, in a sense, you can't sort of insist all the time on environmental factors which affect the entire region, because you get shifts as the intertropical convergence zone shifted north. It brought greater rainfall to the Red Sea region. What did that mean? It meant that along the Nile, for example, cultivators could move outside the narrow strip alongside the Nile and start cultivating peripheral areas of the desert. Exactly the same was true for Saudi Arabia. And there's no coincidence that this was the time of the rise of the great African state of Axum in Ethiopia. Enhanced rainfall, enhanced agricultural productivity in that entire Red Sea region. And from Axum and the port of Adulis, they launched fleets which went out and established entrepôts as far east as Sri Lanka. They dominated for a time the trade of this region. In other words, in the middle of what for the rest of the Indian Ocean world was an economic decline or instability, major instability, for this region it meant enhanced rainfall. Rainfall is critical, therefore enhanced agricultural productivity and enhanced trade. Conventional approaches to Axum ignore that. They also say that the decline of Axum in the 7th century was due to the rise of Persian traders who eclipsed Axumites from the Western Indian Ocean trade. But that is precisely the time, if you think about it, 535, huge volcanic eruption, 541, to 2, the eruption of the first pandemic of plague, and the Greek notices of that say that it came from Ethiopia. In other words, Axum. But that was its origin. It may not have been Axum itself. It could have been elsewhere, but it hit Egypt from Axum. So you have 535, the huge volcanic eruption, 541, the plague, and Ethiopia is specifically mentioned as the origin of it, plus, at the same time, a shift south in the Intertropical Convergence zone, aridification of the climate, abandonment of peripheral desert cultivation, and in Ethiopia, highland Ethiopia, which has been expanding demographically, expanding agriculturally, clearing what forests they had, suddenly they're in crisis. They've denuded the soil, and the climate is becoming increasingly more arid. And there's a shift, there's economic political crisis, the decline of the Axumite regime, and a shift south in populations. In other words, down seeking greater rainfall.
So what would have been their staple agricultural crop? Would it have been teff or?
Oh, well, Ethiopia underwent its own Neolithic Revolution. So it had teff, it had nug, it had a form of Ethiopian banana. I forget the name of it. They had an enormous range of crops.
So it wasn't one big main crop that they had a nice frontage?
No, but they also used the plough. And the plough is much heavier on soil. Had they used the plough in further south, it would have just basically taken the topsoil away. But the Ethiopians are using the plough, and that too is very heavy on the soil. So when you get certain areas which become denuded, in other words, deforestation, if you use the plough on that, then you tend to get soil erosion. So the two stories, just this very migration of the Intertropical Convergence zone, there are El Nino's got an impact, and there are other impacts from the Indian Ocean. But just this very simple migration can acutely affect societies both around the Red Sea and then further south. I've got 5 minutes, so I'll move on, if I may, to the impact of Europeans. And the vast majority of the literature on this region is naturally, given the bias, the Eurocentric bias and the paradigms, it's all about Europeans. How Europeans rounded the Cape and basically dominated the Indian Ocean world. Progressively, and then accelerated version in the 19th century and established colonialism throughout. I think this needs to be thoroughly revised. First of all, think about the demography of Europeans in this region. Europeans might have taken old world diseases to the new world. But when they came into this part of the old world, it was Europeans that suffered. They went down like ninepins. In malarial areas, my expertise, I did my PhD on Madagascar. All the records say that Europeans, any European who visited Madagascar before the late 19th century, 80% died of malaria within 6 months. The rest were incapacitated. I don't know if any of you have had malaria. It is a horrible disease. If you survive, it keeps hitting you. It's recurrent. Europeans in this area were decimated by it. Any of the malarial areas. They suffered from dysentery. They suffered from scurvy. If you visited any of the European enclaves, and it's European enclaves we're talking about, the Europeans had a tiny fragile toehold on certain areas in the Indian Ocean world. Go to Goa, walk around the European cemetery there, look at the ages of the people, the Europeans, who were buried there. They didn't last. It was a death sentence getting sent to the Indian Ocean world. And it didn't matter what your rank was. In the Goan cemeteries, you see as many generals who've lasted maybe 1 to 2 years as soldiers.
It just faded off.
Okay.
This is mostly.
At the same time, the system that Europeans had, it was the mercantilist system. It was the chartered companies or royal companies. It was the age of, I suppose, the early elements of the nation state. They were all competing against each other. They were all fighting each other. There was incredible internecine European conflict. In the 18th century, there were only a couple of years when the French and the English weren't beating the hell out of each other. They were constantly at war. And warfare entails mortality, considerable mortality. They were also fighting against pirates, European pirates, indigenous pirates, who could be pretty merciless and much more adept at sailing around the waters than many of the European chartered company ships. And they then sometimes took on indigenous powers, not always to their advantage. The mortality rate was such that it was impossible for small countries like Portugal to sustain. In order to retain their hold or any sort of credibility in terms of the economic machinery of their enterprises, they had to recruit locals. Sometimes, many times. And remember, they never conquered the Red Sea. That remained in Muslim hands. So they always had to do the long trip around the Cape. And the long trip around the Cape was the long trip, because to get there they had to first sail to Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, and then across. It took on average 6 to 7 months to reach India.
So is that why British used sepoys in India to cut down on the mortality?
That's right. They had to, not just sepoys, they had to recruit local militia to protect their forts, because the mercantilist theory is that the world's resources are limited. You cannot, in other words, you cannot grow wealth, you cannot increase wealth naturally. If you enhance your portion of that wealth, it's at the expense of someone else. So their vision of economic activity is of warfare. And they all had to maintain armies, expensive bureaucracies. And a lot of these were locals. They recruited locals. But they also had, the British had to, for example, the others did as well, had to recruit local sailors to sail their ships back, because the mortality aboard ship was so high. Again, coming into the Indian Ocean, how did they cope? Linguistically, culturally. They had to get local expertise, they had to get local pilots, they had to get local translators. They had to get local cultural brokers, many of whom, by the way, were women. Cultural brokers. There's clear evidence that females, indigenous females, often served as essential partners for European traders. Very few European women sailed into that area. European men would search for local partners, which gave, in many cases, an enhanced role to indigenous women. Again, this area did not want the products of Europe. They considered them shoddy. And in order to pay for the luxuries, the spices, etc., coming to the West, Europeans had to export bullion, gold and silver. And to avoid that, they entered what's called country trade. They tried to get into an arrangement whereby they were shipping, for example, Gujarati cloth to the East Indies, exchanging it for another good and to China, etc. That's why the British developed the opium trade to China, to pay for the imports from that region. By about 1800, now I'll stop here, by about 1800, all the chartered companies were on the verge of bankruptcy. All of them. The British Parliament bailed the East India Company out of it, but the Dutch East India Company collapsed. They were in dire straits. So I would put it to you, the European enterprise was not as successful as is conventionally put. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that really enlightening and